1 Peter chapter 4 and verse 1. It feels a little bit like deja vu because we're going to start with a verse that is or has historically been misappropriated for centuries upon centuries, in fact, probably millennium. And so I'm going to do something about what Luke did this morning. I'm going to try and say what this verse doesn't mean before we actually say what it does mean. So it says this: "Since therefore Christ suffered in the flesh, arm yourself with the same way of thinking. For whoever has suffered in the flesh has ceased from sin." You got that? Whoever has suffered in the flesh has ceased from sin. Wow. This is a beautiful verse, but a rather ugly interpretation of it has dominated a lot of thinking for a long time. The problem of suffering is something that lies as one of the central problematics for Christians and the church. One of the easiest things to throw around is, if God's a God of love, how come there is suffering? And that's a fairly valid question, isn't it? I mean, there is an answer to it, but it's a valid question. Because instinctively, we all respond. If your loved one is struck with some vile disease, instinctively you will pray that prayer, or you will say that thing, which is essentially, why? Yeah? God, you love us. Why do you allow this to happen? So the question of suffering in the Christian is a big deal. But this verse has been taken to produce a theology which I would call vile and upsetting and a destroyer of true faith. What do I mean? Whoever has suffered in the flesh has ceased from sin. There seems to be in this suggestion of this verse an idea of the fact that if you suffer, it's almost as if you are paying for the price of sin. Do you understand? Because it's almost saying if you suffer, you've ceased sinning. And that blatantly isn't true. And equally too, there is a doctrine that is millennia old that talks about the fact that our flesh is something that needs to be punished. And if we do punish our flesh, we will be more spiritual. Now, we find the best embodiment of this in the Roman Catholic Church. So the idea of the hair shirt. Do you know what I mean by a hair shirt? Well, literally a shirt made of hair that is despicably uncomfortable and irritating and causes your flesh to have lesions and sores, was worn as a way of penance. You wear your hair shirt, you suffer, and therefore your sins are being paid for by your suffering. I used to think anyhow that it was just the media that got things so weirdly mixed up. When you see, usually in a horror movie, have anyone seen the movie Carrie? I think I've got the right movie. When Carrie's mum sort of flagellates herself with a whip to make herself suffer. And of course, add a little bit of Freud to that, and you've got this idea that she's tempted by sex, and therefore she can't stand that in her mind. She must punish herself, and by doing that, she eradicates this presence of lust, and therefore she becomes saintly, which is weird. and wrong. And no wonder the world looks at certain types of Christianity and thinks we're crackers. Because I think it's crackers. Where does this come from? Well, I do have a number of themes, I guess, that I keep raising from time to time. You know, I'm fairly infatuated with the Jewish world at the time of Jesus, but I'm also quite fascinated by the Greek world just after the time of Jesus. And there was within decades of Christianity starting, there was a new form of thought came out of the East, mixed with a little bit of Greek philosophy, mixed with Christianity, and it was called Gnosticism. And Gnostic means knowledge, so Gnosticism was about secret knowledge. And the whole ethos behind secret knowledge was, and you might not realize how big this was, how widespread this was. But the belief system used to go something like this. The God of the Old Testament is a different God to the God of the New Testament. The reason that people got into that was they couldn't marry up the justice in the character of God that we see in the Old Testament with God as a God of love in the New Testament. Now, both of those are attributes of God. Neither exists in absolution because they're both characteristics and features of God. And we will not understand the holiness of God, and we will not understand the cross if we don't understand both of those elements. But for people who wanted a simplistic way forward, they would look and say, well, why is a lot of smiting going on in the Old Testament? You know? Why isn't a lot more love going on? And so they started to come up with an idea, and this idea is not a godly idea, but it's based upon a lot of Platonic thought from the Greek culture. And also, as I say, a little bit of Eastern Zoroastrianism as well that sort of merged together. And in particular, these ideas came together in Samaria. And in Samaria, it was really a hotbed of this type of thinking, even before the time of Jesus. These ideas were sort of sloshing around. Because in Israel, if you went to Israel at the time of Jesus, we don't tend to recognize how big it was, but the Greek influence was massive. Again, I've said it before, but we wander through the pages of the New Testament and we don't see a lot of the things that you would have found in Jerusalem. So you would have walked through the streets of Jerusalem and come upon a gymnasium. And in the gymnasium, there would have been athletes training in the nude, fighting, wrestling. There would have been gladiators. There would have been horse racing. There would have been Greek theatre. But because it doesn't have any relevance to the story of Jesus, those details aren't included in the New Testament. But it's very easy for us to think of a pious Jerusalem. It wasn't necessarily like that. There was parts of it that was very pious, but parts of it were very Greek. And when we came to Samaria, shortly after the book of Acts starts, we find a guy called Simon Magus. Simon Magus is the one that wanted to buy the baptism in the Holy Spirit. Now, the early church writers say that he was the instigator of what they called Gnosticism. He was one of the original people who spread this hybrid Christian Greek Zoroastrian thought. And it's important that we understand it because a lot of the letters in the New Testament are written to counter these thinking. Right? So we do find it in scriptures in the sense that we find people writing specifically to put down Gnosticism within the text of the New Testament. Now the idea is this. Hang on to your hats because it gets a little bit weird. The Gnostic says, somewhere over there, so far down there you can't see it, there's the original creator God. But then God creates something close to himself. And then that character creates another emanation, and then another one, and another one, and another one, eventually coming down, who knows how many thousands of emanations, to this God who creates this earth. And what they said was, this creator of this world was almost fallen himself. You understand? And the Gnostics all said this: spirit is good, but flesh and matter is evil. Right? And so when Jesus comes and talks about the Father, they say, oh, he was referring to the ultimate creator, not the creator of this world. Can you see how dodgy this is? Can you see also, though, how with some of the things that Paul was saying, the God of this world, in Ephesians, talking about the devil, can you see how people could get confused on this weird line between the two? Now then, the punchline is this. This is the bit you have to understand. If flesh is evil, you can do one of two things. You can either get into a way of thinking that says this: flesh is evil, but spirit is good. As long as my spirit's okay, it doesn't matter what happens in the flesh, because all flesh is evil. Right? And they might quote things like, all our righteousness is like filthy rags. So even the good stuff we do in the flesh is evil. So it doesn't matter what we do. Right? Therefore, punchline, you can live your life as you want it. Because it's only the spirit that counts. Rasputin apparently was a monk who followed this Gnostic tradition. And he would say, the more you sin, the more grace abounds. Therefore, you should sin, so that grace abounds even more. And I think he proudly claimed that he would commit every possible sin in order that there would be more grace in the world. Right? Hey, we're going to get into some of that suggestion in this chapter. Christian recognize the fact this is a heresy. Right? But the other heresies linked to it as well. And the opposite side of the coin is this: flesh is evil. Therefore, we must beat up our flesh in order to be spiritual. Put that hair shirt on. What about that Catholic practice of hooks? They have little sharp hooks in a belt that they wear around the tops of the leg that sort of catch. Sorry? Salice. Wow. It's all sadomasochism, dodgy stuff, isn't it? Because you're punishing your flesh, therefore you will be pure. Yeah? Not weird. The thing is, this is not, how shall I put it, irrelevant stuff. There will be people in Billingham, Catholics in Billingham, who will be practicing some of this stuff. There'll be priests, or maybe they've got more sense, I don't know. But there will. There'll be people in this area who believe that you have to punish your flesh in order to be spiritual. And there'll be other people who will say, it doesn't matter what I do on a Friday night, because where sin abounds, grace abounds more. I've got to say both of these things are the death of real spirituality. They're an ancient heresy that goes back almost to the beginning. And unfortunately, those who want to try and produce ammunition for themselves, just as we were talking this morning, will take things out of context and they will try and claim key verses for themselves. So let me read this to you again and listen carefully. Since therefore Christ suffered in the flesh, arm yourself with the same way of thinking. For whoever has suffered in the flesh has ceased from sin. So if that's the wrong interpretation, we've got to put the right interpretation on it. So what's the right interpretation for these verses? Well, there's a number of ways we could approach this. We could make an argument, I think, that goes something like this. That if you're suffering for the faith, quite frankly, if you've shown martyrdom for the faith, if you're willing to put your head on the block and say, I will not deny Christ, and you suffer in persecution, well, the chances are that you're so focused that you actually will be living a life that's on the straight and narrow. That would be fair, wouldn't it? What's clear is the Bible is telling us that we must not be naive, foolish children in the faith who think that when we become Christians, there will be no suffering. Everybody suffers. The Old Testament proverb says, we're born to trouble as the sparks fly upwards. Life will have troubles and trials and suffering within it. But there is a special type of suffering, I agree. That if we suffer for the sake of Christ, we are promised a crown in glory. That our hearts have not got to be residing down here, but they've got to be residing in heaven. We are not laying up treasure for ourselves here, we're laying up treasure for ourselves up there. And so if trouble does come in life, well, that's life. But if trouble comes in life for the sake of your faith, then recognize that you're moving on to a higher plane of spiritual living. We must never punish our flesh for the sake of it. But if we do suffer for the sake of Christ, we must recognize the fact that we are called to a high walk in God. And this is what the term martyrs was for. The martyrs are those who will suffer for the sake of Christ. And we believe in martyrdom, not the way that Islam believes it, not the way the Catholics believe it. But in life, if you are called to a path of persecution that leads to suffering, be aware there is something very special about that calling, and don't resist it, but embrace it. And that's a tough thing to stand in the pulpit and preach. Because inside I'm going, but please, Lord, let that be for everybody else here, but not me. Actually, let Athena off as well, please. Actually, let Luke off as well, please. Actually, let Amelia off as well. And then I've got good pals in here, so can we let... But you understand, don't you? It's a tough thing, isn't it? Literally, when you go through it, it's tough. But it is nevertheless right. But there is another way that we maybe a better way to look at this verse. Although what I've said is true. Because this follows on, and don't forget there is no chapter breaks in the original letter. Right? Peter didn't put the pen down and said, chapter 4. It all was one letter. What's he been talking about before this? Has been baptism. And so, when he was talking about baptism, what he's talking about is the fact that when we go under the waters as death to ourselves. And we rise in Christ. So now bear that in mind and listen to this. Therefore, since you've suffered in the flesh, Arm yourself with the same way of thinking, that whoever suffered in the flesh has ceased from sin, as to live the rest of the time in the flesh no longer for human passions, but in the will of God. So it may be that what's more in the mind of Paul here is the fact that we die to self and we rise in Christ, and we live no longer in the passions of the self and the flesh, but we live in God. Now, I don't mind which choice you make on that. The one thing I want you to get from it, there is no merit in suffering to become holy. Suffering by itself as a tool for spirituality is nonsense. Making yourself suffer as penance is nonsense. Non-scriptural and heretical, and will do you not an ounce of good. But now he goes on and says this. Let me just read the second part of that verse. So it's verse 2. So as to live the rest of the time in the flesh, no longer for human passions, but for the will of God. For the time that is past suffices for doing what the Gentiles want to do. Living in sensuality, passions, drunkenness, orgies, drinking parties, lawless idolatry. And with respect to this, they're surprised when you don't join in with the same flood of debauchery in the millennium. But they will give an account to him who is ready to judge the living and the dead. Wow. It's Friday night. It's going out and having a good time. Going out and getting drunk. Right? Waking up in either somebody else's bed or somebody else waking up in your bed. Passion, sensuality, orgies, idolatry. The same flood of debauchery. So actually, Peter has turned around here, and what he's saying is, you cannot do what these Gnostics are saying. Sin so that grace might abound. Live whichever way you want. He said, no, you can't live like that. You can't do it. I hadn't realized, but there's somebody that Luke and I knew, and we both knew him in a different context. He was in Luke's world. I won't say which world, how Luke knew him, and I won't say how I knew him, but I knew that he was a worship leader. And I was amazed to find out when Luke told me, oh yeah, he goes out on a Friday night and he goes drinking and he goes out and not being funny, he's got loads of girls pregnant and you think, Lord, and he's a worship leader. I won't say any more because somebody might watch this and know who I'm referring to, and I don't want to embarrass them. You can't live like that. You can't say it doesn't matter. You can't say I'm forgiven so I can do what I want. You can't do it. As God, as it was said this morning, God is not mocked. You can't get away with it. I know people make mistakes. I know people make mistakes. I've made mistakes. I'm not saying whether this type, but what I'm saying is people make mistakes of all sorts. And people can find themselves caught up by mistake in things. And then deeply, deeply regret it. I'm going to be talking about integrity soon, and we're going to talk in particular about what happens when mistakes happen in your life. But you can never become blasé about it. I believe there is forgiveness. I believe there's consequences. I believe that we have to understand that we are called not to live for ourselves, but to live for Him. We are called, if suffering is the way that lies ahead, for the sake of Christ, then embrace it. and not only embrace it, but recognize what it means as a crown of glory in heaven. And I know one day we'll stand before him and cast out crowns before him because we'll say we don't deserve any of the rewards he gives us. But he will give us rewards nevertheless. And then he goes on to say, and this is the verse that's odd, because it's just dropped in. For this is why the gospel was preached even to those who are dead, that though judged in the flesh the way people are, they might live in the spirit the way that God does. Now I've got to say, this is a tough old verse. I've also got to say, we believe it ties in with not only what is gone in the previous chapter, because there's clearly some point of connection, and it also ties in with what he's going to say in his next letter too. But last time in chapter 3, we looked at the idea that Christ descended into hell and preached to the spirits there from before the time of Noah. And it said spirits, it didn't say the dead. Here we read that he's preached to the dead and not spirits. Are they the same thing? No, not necessarily at all. So what I thought I'd do, I'd go over something with you. So I'm just going to, because I can't see this now, so I'm going to have to come over here. And let me just go through this PowerPoint. We have heaven. And we have earth. And I've put Eden on the earth there. You'll notice that I'm a brilliant artist. It's not a tortoise, it's earth with Eden on it. And I'm going to try and put sort of Peter 3 and Peter 4 together so you get what's going on. So if we go to the next one, please. Oh, there's the flood. Do you like my little ark? That's a nifty little ark, isn't it? And if we go to the next one, we'll see that there is a place of the dead. Now let me try and explain before we go any further. Don't move on. One of the descriptions that Jesus gives about the place of the dead comes from his story. I won't say parable, because he didn't announce it as a parable, and because he didn't announce it as a parable, I'm not going to claim it's a parable, but the story of the rich man and the poor man. And if you remember in that story, the name of Dives and Lazarus has become associated with this story. I don't know, I'm not going to get caught up in that at the moment. But essentially there is a rich man in the place of the dead. And it talks about it being a place of punishment. A place where he is desperate for a drop of water to be placed upon his tongue. And he has 5 brothers. And he wants God to send someone to warn the 5 brothers. Now, in fairness, when Jesus tells a story, and it might just be a story, it might not be theology, so I'm just warning you here. But what's interesting is the high priest at the time had 5 brothers and was a very rich man. And it may well have been taken by the people who were hearing that Jesus was being very political in what he was saying, because he might have been suggesting that the very best of the rich men, when he went to hell, was going to find himself in trouble. So I'll just mention that along the way. But the picture that Jesus painted was this. Because the rich man looked and saw afar off somebody, a beggar, that he'd walked past every day. And this poor man had begged at the door of the rich man and had sores and was in a sorry state. And the rich man hadn't done anything about the poor man. And it describes the poor man as being in Abraham's bosom. In other words, a place of security and safety, being held by the patriarch, if you like, being comforted. So you've got a story of one man being in a place of comfort, and one man being in a place of torment. And then apparently a gap that no man can cross in between the two. Yeah? So what we find then is we find a place of the dead. We find what I'm going to refer to as paradise, and what I'm going to refer to as Tartarus, and an abyss between the two. Now, when Jesus was dying upon the cross, it's interesting, because he turned around to the dying thief and he said, "This day you will be with me in..." And yet we read that when Jesus died, he descended down to the place of the dead. So that's inescapable from what Jesus said. And this isn't in that story of Dives and Lazarus. This is where he said to the dying thief. So therefore, the only way for that to come true is if paradise is where? In the place of the dead. So what I'm going to suggest to you is paradise here is the place where the poor man was. Abraham's bosom. The place of comfort. But there was an abyss. And at the other place was a place of torment. Now we've mentioned before that in the Old Testament there is a very, very dim, hard to see picture emerging about the place of the dead. Sheol. It was never called hell. Forget the word hell. Hell is a Greek word that it's late. We're not going to really think about it as hell. Not yet. But the place of the dead. And in this place of the dead we read in Psalms and Proverbs, and again it might be metaphor, it might not be accurate language, it might be poetic language. But we read about a grayness, a place of forgetfulness, a place of transparent grayness, shall we say. And that certainly was the Roman and Greek view about the place of the dead. Jesus gives it colour because he talks about this place being a place of torment. Now, we don't like Jesus doing this. He's very naughty. How dare Jesus talk about suffering for eternity? He just hasn't got it right yet. He isn't being as loving as he should be. But of course, that goes back to the problem we've talked about before. Seeing the God of the Old Testament and the New Testament of having those joint attributes of justice and love. And we must never get our pen and scratch it through the words of Jesus because we find them inconvenient. Because I know what is going to stand the test of time. And that's the words of Christ. Because not a thing that he said will ever pass away. So we must adjust our thinking to accommodate Christ, not remodel Christ to fit our sensibilities. Yeah? So what that means is this. Today you will be with me in paradise. The place of torment, a place of discomfort, a great place of regret. That word Tartarus is just the Greek word for this place. It's useful for us to put a name tag on this place. We could just call it Sheol, but technically Sheol embraces the whole of the place of the dead. And then we come to the idea of the abyss, the gap that no man can cross in between. Okay, so now let's move forward. And we're moving forward to the next event, and the next event is the fall of the angels, referred to in Peter. And at that point, referred to, of course, in Genesis 6, referred to in Peter 3, when Jesus goes and preaches to the spirits in the place of the dead. If we go to the next slide, please. We find the cross. That should have been before the other one. It's my fault, sorry. If we go to the next one, we find Jesus from the cross descends to preach and declare to the spirits in the abyss, to those chained in everlasting darkness, to those creatures who left the first estate in disobedience. And then if we go to the next one, Jesus also, while he's there, goes, according to this, and preaches to the dead in paradise. But he does so for a purpose. And the next one, that should be Ephesians 4, my apologies. He leads captivity captive, and he takes paradise, empties it. All those who'd been looking forward under the covenant of the Jews, all those who had been not only having the sacrifices done, but living the way that God would call them to, they are taken and the others are still left. And he leads captivity captive. So if I go to Ephesians 4, he's saying there's one body, one spirit, just as you're called to one hope that belongs to your call. One Lord, one faith, one baptism, one God and Father over all, who is over all and through all. But grace is given to us according to the measure of Christ's gift. Therefore it says, when he ascended on high, he led a host of captives, and he gave gifts to men. In saying he ascended, what does it mean? But he descended to the lower regions of the earth. And he who descended is the one who also ascended far above the heavens, that he might fill all things. So what we find is this, that Jesus empties paradise and takes it to the Father. And this, I find two references in the Gospels. I find beautiful references. Now, I'm sure I'll have mentioned them to you, but I want to just make sure they're labored again. When Jesus rose from the dead on that Sunday morning, and the stone was rolled from the tomb, and there was Mary, who had been planning to try and find somewhere to get the stone rolled aside and put spices and ointments on the body of Christ. But when she gets there, the stone is rolled away. And she's crying. And then at the side of her, she sees a man. And under, of course, strict Jewish law, she wasn't allowed to look up into his face of a stranger. You weren't allowed eye contact if you're a woman. So she looks and no doubt sees the body of him there, the robe. And it says she presumed he was the gardener. And then she says, tell us, where have they taken him? Where have they taken him? I want to go and anoint the body. And Jesus says, Mary. At that point, she looks up. She says, Master. And she goes to touch him. But he says to her, what? Don't touch me, because I'm not yet ascended to the Father. Hours later, Jesus appears in an upper room to the disciples. And he says to Thomas, Thomas, get your finger, bonny lad, and stick it in the nail hole. Get your fist, stick it into my side. This is me, the real Jesus, in the body returned. Hang on. Mary, don't touch me. I've not yet ascended to the Father. Thomas, touch me. Therefore, what had happened between the two things? He ascended to the Father in the middle of them. After Mary and before Thomas. Before that point, he doesn't want to be touched because he's not yet ascended. Once he has ascended to the Father and come back again to the upper room, he's happy to be touched. I find it compelling that he stopped with the whole of paradise with him, waiting, clicking their heels while Jesus has a conversation with Mary. Because he loves her and she's upset. And he's not going to leave her without some comfort. Wow. And there is another verse that backs this up, because in Matthew it says, when the earthquake had taken place at the crucifixion, loads of the graves had opened up. And then it's got this weird verse in it where it says some of the people who, died were in those tombs, and it says that they were resurrected and walking around a little while in Jerusalem. I don't think they were doing it long. I think they were only walking around while Jesus was having a conversation with Mary. But they were seen. Now, I find this theology compelling, because Jesus said, this day you'll be with me in paradise. Paradise must therefore be in the place of the dead. The story that Jesus told about paradise in Abraham's bosom and the other place, again, tallies. And what Peter is saying here about going to preach to the dead, this preaching to the dead in Peter is really just about the liberation of hell, or the liberation, rather, of paradise. And so we find, wonderfully, the gospel was preached to the dead. The good news was declared. And he's saying that there will be judgment in the flesh, the way that people are. And he wants us to live in the Spirit the way that God does. Does that make sense? Let me just go further. By all means. I'm going to hold you until I finish the next couple of slides, and I'm going to come to you. So, as of now, if we go to the next one, when we die, we're absent from the body and go to be with Christ. We no longer go down to paradise because it's empty. And then what happens after that is there will come a time of the judgment. Now, we already will be with Christ. This is not about the rapture. I'm not going to go into that now tonight, because otherwise we'll be here a long time. But the day of judgment will come, and this chapter speaks about the judgment that will come. And one day, those not in Christ will find themselves leaving Tartarus to the judgment. And then we find, after that, Tartarus emptied, and we find a lake of fire. And the next one, please. There will be a final judgment to that place of the lake of fire. And then, after that, we find a new heaven and we find a new earth. Sean, your question.
You know the people in the abyss, the spirits?
Yeah.
Is there salvation for them?
No.
So can I ask a simple question? Why did he go down to preach to them then?
When we did this, we described the fact that when it was to declare the truth. It wasn't to preach as in to try and convert. I don't know why angels could have ever thought they could pick a different side to God and think that they had any chance of success.
So those spirits could fall in angels?
Correct.
Yeah, that makes sense.
There is the word doom literally means the pronouncement of the sentence. So a prisoner in court, if the death penalty was announced, the judge would put the death cap on and give the voice of doom, literally, the pronouncement of the sentence of death. And part of the process of judgment, if you like, they'd been arrested. At this point, Jesus goes and lays the formal charges. or pronounces the sentence of the voice of doom, if you like, to those who are doomed in darkness. One day the judgment will happen, and death and hell will give up its dead, and they'll be cast into the lake of fire, where the enemy and the Antichrist are. There will come a time when final judgments will take place. And so what we find is, in chapter 3, I believe it's referring to the spirits. In chapter 4, I believe it's referring to the liberation of the dead. One thing I do find fascinating, and here's a challenge for someone to pick up on something, to have some thinking about it. I'm going to just dodge back into Ephesians for a second. Ephesians 4. It talks about one body, one Lord, and then it says grace is given to us according to the measure of Christ's gift. And then it says, therefore it says, when he ascended on high, he led a host of captives and he gave gifts to men. There is something to be mined here in why gifts were given to men, and these gifts are prophets, apostles, evangelists, shepherds, and teachers to equip the saints for the ministry. The instigation of those gifts is given because of his liberation of paradise and his presenting them before the Father. And Paul is making a very clear link because he says, therefore it says, he ascended on high and led a host of captives and gave gifts to men. And I believe that, well, I'll give you some thoughts. I was going to just leave it for you, but I'll throw some. When a Roman general won a battle, a great battle, he would be invited back to Rome. And when they came back on that main Appian Way, they would raise triumphal arches, like the Arc de Triomphe that you see in Paris, which is a mimic of one of the Roman arches. And they would raise the arch for the general who has won the battle. And then when they came in before the emperor would award gifts. And they would award gifts to the conquering hero, for the conquering hero to give out to their entourage. Do you know what this means? When Christ went back to heaven, God rewarded him by letting him have gifts. And those gifts he chose were for pastors and teachers and apostles and prophets to be given to the church. I don't want to be over-diverted, but let me say this. If those are truly the gifts that Christ has given to the church, how much must those gifts be valued? And maybe it's appropriate because it ties into this morning's message. Do not minimize the importance of these gifts. House churches that set up with 4 or 5 people who instead of having meetings have coffee and a chat, who instead of breaking bread have a cream cake, who instead of having sound doctrine from a gift ministry, chat about how they feel instead of what the word really says. Chat about how they feel about the word, what the word says, rather than delving into the true meaning of the word. God has given apostles, prophets, evangelists, shepherds, and teachers to equip the saints for the work of ministry and build up the body of Christ until we attain the unity of the faith and the knowledge of the Son of God, to mature manhood, and to the measure of the fullness of the stature of Christ. No longer children, tossed about to and fro by every wave of doctrine. I think of Christ with all the things that the Father could have rewarded him with, chose for these to be his gifts to his church. We must prize them. And maybe we just leave Peter there. The tough stuff's over. I'm sure we can go on from there. Let me just read you where it says. The end of all things is at hand, and therefore be self-controlled and sober-minded. For the sake of your prayers, above all, keep loving one another earnestly, since love covers a multitude of sins. You know, that's true, isn't it? We have grandchildren. You might have heard about this. It might be a surprise to you, I suppose. You might not know we've got grandchildren. When we see them doing wrong, we recognize them doing wrong. We're not blind. But love conquers a multitude of sins. Because we love them so much, we're not going to see our Eden cheated cards, sorry Eden if you're watching this, and take offense at it. We just look at her and saying, what did you do there? But love covers a multitude of sins. We shouldn't ignore sin, but you should love each other enough not to take offense. You should love each other enough to be kind. Show hospitality to one another without grumbling. In those days, there was itinerant ministries, and they would land and need putting up. And not being funny, the inns that they had in those days weren't necessarily places you wanted a Christian to be staying in. Paul, a great deal of the time, finds accommodation in the houses of Jews and Christians who kindly put him up. And we must have open houses, prepared to help people. As each one has received a gift, use it to serve one another as good stewards of God's varied grace. Whoever speaks is one who speaks the oracle of God. Whoever serves is one who serves by the strength that God supplies, in order that in everything God might be glorified through Jesus Christ. To him belong glory and dominion forever. And beloved, don't be surprised if fiery trials come on you to test you, as though it's something strange. But rejoice as you share Christ's suffering, that you might rejoice and be glad when his glory is revealed. And if you're insulted for the name of Christ, you're blessed, because the Spirit of glory in God rests upon you. But let none of you suffer as a murderer, a thief, or an evildoer, a meddler. If anyone suffers a Christian, let him not be ashamed, but let him glory God in that name. For it's time to judgment to begin in the household of God. And if it begins with us, what will the outcome be for those who do not obey the gospel of God? And if the righteous are scarcely saved, what will become of the ungodly and the sinner? Therefore, let those who suffer according to God's will entrust their souls to a faithful Creator while doing good. May the Lord bless you. May the Lord keep you. May the Lord make his face to shine upon you all and give you peace.